I'm sure you've seen the endless stories about Russia's potential invasion of Ukraine, and if you have, you've probably, accurately, got the vibe that most of the world isn't looking kindly on Russia at the moment. In recent years, relations have frayed, sanctions have been imposed, and Russia has been cast as a major villain on the world stage. It seems though that another sometimes villain is looking to form a pact: China. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why China and Russia are getting on so well, their recent joint statement, and what it means for global politics. If you want more updates on the Russia-Ukraine situation, then you can find that over on the TLDR EU channel. There's a link in the description of this video, so make sure you're subscribed over there to get all of the news you need. So, we've actually done a video on this topic before, but we thought it was worth doing an update because Sino-Russian relations have improved even further since then. Last week, Putin arrived at the Beijing Winter Olympics as the guest of honor, and after talks on Friday, Xi and Putin agreed to a 30-year contract for a new gas pipeline between Russia's Far East region and northeast China, with an annual capacity of 10 billion cubic meters per year. Russia already sends gas to China via its Power of Siberia pipeline, which opened in 2019, and combined with the new pipeline, is now predicted to send about 50 billion cubic meters annually by 2025. For context, that's about 1/3 of what Russia usually sends to Europe. On the same day, the two countries released a joint statement, which was, interesting. The statement was cut into 4 sections. The first section claims that both China and Russia are democracies, and argues that there's no one-size-fits-all template for democracy. In a thinly veiled dig at the US, the joint statement condemns, quote, certain states' attempts to impose their own democratic standards on other countries, and argues that the global hegemony is against the spirit of democracy and a serious threat to global peace and stability. Somewhat unsurprisingly, China and Russia go on to argue that the advocacy of democracy and human rights must not be used to put pressure on other countries, and that while they acknowledge the noble goal of human rights, they should be balanced against each country's unique national features. The second section of the statement talks about areas of future cooperation, including the Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Arctic, climate change via the Paris Agreement, and the ongoing pandemic. Again, there's a sassy paragraph about how the two sides, quote, oppose politicization about the origin of the new coronavirus, which basically translates to, we don't want to talk about the lab leak theory. The third section, though, is probably the most interesting. Here, Russia expresses its support for the One China principle, and China opposes the enlargement of NATO. This is pretty interesting, because historically, China's so-called non-interference policy has involved staying out of other countries' foreign policy disputes, and it goes to show just how friendly the two sides have become. Both sides also say that they oppose America's Indo-Pacific strategy. And there's also an interesting bit about how both sides oppose so-called colour revolutions. In most of the media, the term colour revolutions usually refers to the series of pro-democracy revolutions in post-Soviet states in the early 2000s. Here, though, the term seems to refer to what Russia and China see as revolutions sponsored by the West. The fourth and final section calls for a new world order based on mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and mutually beneficial cooperation, and states that the Sino-Russian friendship has, quote, no limits. This comes on top of a blossoming personal relationship between Putin and Xi. Xi once went as far as describing Putin as his best friend and colleague. There are some remarkable personal similarities between these two leaders. They were both born just 6 months apart, their fathers fought in World War II, they both have daughters, and they both rode into power via anti-corruption campaigns. So, you get the point. Xi's China and Putin's Russia are becoming besties. But onto the second part of the video. How did we get here? Well, this is a pretty interesting question, because historically, Russia and China haven't been best mates. In the 60s, when they were the two big communist superpowers, they both wanted to be number one. They even had a brief border war in 1969, but tensions were permanently high until 1991, when they made up and signed the 1991 Sino-Soviet border agreement. So how did we get from border skirmishes to best mates? Well, as we see it, there are three main drivers: cooperation on the Sino-Russian border, complementary economies, and political similarities. Let's start with the border. China and Russia share a massive border, which is over 4,000 kilometers long. As you're probably aware of by now, both China and Russia are pretty keen on border skirmishes and reclaiming their historical territories, which is why, prior to their border agreement in 1991, both countries spent enormous amounts of resources manning and monitoring the border to prevent the other one from encroaching. Since the 1991 agreement, though, trust and cooperation between the two sides with regard to the border has steadily increased, which has allowed them to focus their political energies elsewhere. Today, thanks to the troop build-up in Ukraine, Russia currently has the fewest troops on the Sino-Russian border since 1922, which goes to show quite how much trust has improved. This cooperation over the border is in both countries' self-interest too, and the subsequent trust provided is the basis for the friendly relations we see today. Secondly, though, the two countries are economically complementary. Back in the 60s, China and Russia had relatively similar economies. They were both energy and commodity exporters. Today, this has all changed. China became a net energy importer in 1994, and its rapidly developing economy means that Chinese demand for energy and commodities has only increased. Russia, on the other hand, has remained a petro-state, with an economy centered around oil and gas exports. Western sanctions introduced after Crimea in 2014, and the prospect of further sanctions, including the cancellation of Nord Stream 2, have meant that Russia is now looking to diversify away from Europe. And you can see what we're getting at. China wants more energy from different sources, and Russia wants to sell energy outside of Europe. In this sense, Russia and China currently make great economic partners, and this is why trade between the two has increased significantly. In 2017, Russia exported about $15 billion worth of goods to China, mostly oil. By 2019, that had nearly quadrupled to $57 billion, with China overtaking Germany to become Russia's largest trading partner. At the same time, Russia overtook Saudi Arabia to become China's biggest oil supplier. And if the new pipeline is finished, Russia will supply the Chinese with about 3 times more oil than the Saudis by 2025. It's worth noting that this relationship is pretty one-sided. While Russia is selling more oil to China, China has a pretty diversified energy supply, and the 50 billion cubic meters that Russia is predicted to supply by 2025 will only amount to about 10% of China's total consumption. According to 2018 data, Russia is only China's 13th largest trading partner. China, on the other hand, is by far and away Russia's largest trading partner. And this is only expected to increase. Essentially, Russia is far more dependent on China than China is on Russia. And this doesn't bode particularly well for Russia, given that China has unilaterally set itself demanding net zero targets, which imply that Chinese demand for Russian gas will decline in the coming decades. Anyway, you get the point. For now at least, Russia and China make good economic partners. The third driving force behind this relationship, though, is their political similarities. Obviously, both regimes are pretty autocratic, with questionable human rights records. And at the moment, they also share a mutual distrust of the US, which was apparent from their joint statement. So, what does this all mean for the state of global politics going forward? Well, as we see it, there are 3 big geopolitical takeaways. Firstly, as we mentioned earlier, China's position on NATO, which amounts to an active position on international foreign policy outside of China's orbit, which seems to mark a partial break from their non-interference policy. This was also apparent in China's recent expression of support for Argentina's claim of the Falkland Islands. The second major change is that the Russia-China alliance looks like the start of a parallel world order to the current Western-led bloc. It's hard to say whether this is a good or a bad thing, but it will limit the effectiveness of certain foreign policy instruments, like sanctions, which are most effective when applied multilaterally. The third major geopolitical takeaway is that this is a symptom of American foreign policy failure. The current situation contrasts to Nixon's approach in the 70s, when the US successfully pulled China away from Russia and towards the US. At the time, the US maintained their hegemony via better relations with both China and Russia than they had with one another. Now though, the reverse is true. So that's the video. China and Russia are becoming besties, but what do you think? Is this a terrifying autocratic threat to American hegemony? Or are you looking forward to this multipolar order? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and TLDR EU to get all of the updates you need. A special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.